Thank you so much. Welcome again.
Okay, all right. So I was saying that you could not have scheduled this talk at a better time. I'm actually speaking in a multi-purpose conference room from Spelman College. Spelman College is only one out of two historically Black colleges specifically for women. And so I graduated from Spelman College, and it's come full circle because I'm actually here for the launch of a Labor Institute by the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative, yes, which is a wonderful, groundbreaking group of labor scholars, labor strategists, labor organizers who are addressing the particular needs, the work needs, and struggles of Black workers in the South, right? And so much happens in the Atlanta University Center. Spelman College is right next door to three other groundbreaking Black colleges and universities. There's Morehouse College, there's Morris Brown College, and Clark Atlanta University. So just really going to college in this rich historical space, because all of the colleges, all of the schools I just named were some of the first schools for Black people after slavery. Right. And at Spelman, I was fortunate to take courses with professors who really emphasized the importance of learning Black women's history. I was a comparative women's studies major. Some people in the audience might be familiar with Beverly Guy Sheftall, who is a feminist, a Black feminist scholar here. She was my advisor, and many other Black women professors here. So, I grew up in, yeah, I say grow up, right? Because you grow when you're in college, ideally, in a space where Black women's history was central to everything. So I came out of college with that grounding. And when I was writing my book, the first book that you mentioned, Mia, about Irish immigrant and Southern Black domestic workers, um, I was trained because of my classes here at Spelman to always ask, what were Black women doing at the time? How were they resisting oppression, right? Because it's not enough just to read how white people at the time viewed them, right? And the stereotypes of Black women at the time, but what were Black women? Because Black women were always resisting, right? These stereotypes. So I wanted to know, okay, I know about the labor exploitation of Black women in household work. Now, what were Black women doing to organize against labor exploitation? And I came across Nannie Helen Burroughs, who started the first labor organization of the early 20th century for Black domestic workers. So I traveled at that point in time, I was in Texas. So I traveled to Washington, D.C., where her collection is located. It's an enormous collection, over 10,000 documents, and they're not digitized. So I had to make several trips to the Library of Congress. And so I came across this pamphlet during the first visit, and it was a pamphlet for her school. And in that pamphlet, she bragged and she boasted about her school. She said, "My school is the only school in the nation for established and managed by Black women." So at the time, Spelman was the only other school in the nation for Black women and girls. So because I love my alma mater, I was at first offended. And I said, who is this woman throwing shade toward my alma mater? Like, what is going on here? But it was such a bold statement. And it was, part of the reason why I was offended, because there was a lot of truth to what she was saying, because Spelman was established by two white women missionaries. So I said, let me keep digging further here. And then in this pamphlet, she also came for Howard University. And she said, Howard, my school is unique because it's not like Howard. Howard is actually funded by the federal government, which means that it belongs to white men. It's really not a school that's run by Black people. And I said, wow. So I really have to dig further into her history because she was based in DC and she was coming for another Black school in DC. And for a woman to do that in the early 1900s, I mean, you have to have a lot of courage to do that, especially as a Black woman. So that's what led me on this path to really wanting to find out more about her. And again, the items aren't digitized, so I had to keep going back and keep going back. And I just said, wow, someone needs to write a book about her. Yeah.
I'm getting goosebumps just listening to you. So she first is the labor that was involved, the just the
Mhm.
intensive labor of you going and looking through it. So we just assume everything is on the internet, but there's such
Yeah.
a small piece of what we actually know about the history of a lot
Yeah.
of these women. And I'm so glad you wrote this book because she sounds fierce and formidable, and she has done some amazing work. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. You
Mhm.
said at that time in the
Mhm.
1900s. Can you help us understand what was the economic and the political landscape like for Black people? And also you
Yeah.
mentioned Jane Crow. So we are familiar with
Mhm.
Jim Crow. Can you help us
Mhm.
understand what's Jane Crow referring to?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So I'll take that one first. Jane Crow is actually a term that legal theorist Pauli Murray, who was a Black woman who was an attorney, and she was also a legal theorist, and she actually crafted the argument for the 1954 case Brown versus Board of Education, which led to the desegregation of schools here in the U.S. But she never got the credit for it. Thurgood Marshall, who was the first Black Supreme Court justice, got credit for it, and he certainly worked on the case, but she came up with the theoretical framing for it. And so she didn't get credit because she was a woman, right? And so the intellectual work, Black women weren't credited for, as well as their community organizing work, their scholarship. And so she created this term, Jane Crow, to highlight intersecting racial and gender discrimination that Black women faced during the civil rights movement era and during what we call, or what most people call, the Jim Crow era. So I used Jane Crow in the book to really highlight how Black women experienced both racial and gender discrimination, right? And it's always important to hold that intersectional analysis, because if we only focus on the racial discrimination, then we miss their gendered experiences. And if we only focus on gender, then we miss their racial experiences. And so during that time, most Black women, due to legalized racial and gender discrimination in employment, um, were concentrated in domestic service and sharecropping. They literally could not find many jobs outside of those two occupations. And at the time in the early 1900s, when Burroughs was most active, those were two of the most exploitative occupations for women, right? So some Black women preferred to work in factories, but white American women and white immigrant women were preferred for those jobs. And at times, white women would say, we don't want to work with Black women. So sometimes the hiring managers for factories would say, okay, I'm not hiring Black women because I don't want a race war. right, in the factory. So there are a lot of divisions that were in place. And so Black women were paid the least out of most women in the United States at the time. And I always use the phrase Black women and girls in the book because of the economic, the vast economic disparities at the intersections of race and gender. Many Black women started working as young as 10 years old. So if you go back to the US Department of Labor data, and the census, even from the Women's Bureau, I put some of that in the book. You can see that over 2 million Black girls were working at 10 years of age. Um, so, so again, in these exploitative occupations, limited educational opportunities, that connects to what I said earlier about why Spelman is so important to me, because there weren't many schools that were open for us at that time. After slavery, especially in the South. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, Spelman is in Atlanta, Georgia, so we're in the deep South. Um, the white people in charge, white lawmakers, passed laws that really made it, almost illegal for Black women and girls to get an education. And if there were schools set up, they only went up to a certain grade. So maybe you could only go to school for what we would call, the fifth grade, right? So maybe you get very basic, very introductory reading and writing skills, but nothing past that. So there was, also Black women, it was hard for them to vote. Just like now, most Black women live in the South, and there were laws here that made it hard for Black people to vote. So if you wanted to vote, you would have to pay a poll tax. If you're already making very low wages, most people couldn't afford those poll taxes. People at the voting polls would issue literacy tests and actually jelly bean jar tests. So they would put jelly beans in a jar and then and present it to a Black person who would come and try to vote and say, well, you have to guess the exact number of jelly beans in this jar in order for us to give you a ballot in order to vote, right? And these were just, random tests that even the people giving the test didn't even know the answers to, right? They didn't even know the answers. So as you can imagine, any number someone would have come up with would have been wrong, right? And Black women and men were actually lynched for trying to vote. So when we celebrate the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, the struggle for Black women continued much longer until after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they wouldn't be able to vote really until 44 years later. So it was a very, very harsh landscape. And even in terms of labor, if you were a domestic worker, if you were accused of by your employer by disobeying him or her, you could go to jail. Georgia was known for the convict leasing system where you could be, Black women and girls could be sentenced to really harsh prison sentences, sometimes for decades. And sometimes you were paroled to work in a white family's home for several years without pay. If anyone has ever seen The Color Purple, the movie The Color Purple, the story of Miss Sophia demonstrates that, how, she was sentenced instead of spending all of her sentence in a jail cell. Part of the sentence was paid out by actually working for free as a domestic worker. So it was very hard during that time.
It's it sounds positively horrifying. And just to set the context for people who are just joining us for the first time, At Women in AI Ethics, we believe that technology should not be the center of our focus. Like we talk about AI, all the conversations are dominated by the builders of these technologies, and the conversations and the narratives are about the technology, when it should be about the people. And we always try to draw connections back to where are these, we talk about biases as a technical issue and a technological issue, but biases come from history, our lack of history, historical perspective. Like these biases are embedded, like you said, the Jim Crow era, the data sets, like you will, or even the missing data sets. For example, like women's
Mhm,
health, Black women's
mhm,
health. Why
mhm,
Black women have higher mortality rates than
mhm,
during pregnancy, and there are like I could go on and on about it, how we connect, and yet we always think of these things in silos, right? Because we've been trained to
mhm,
only think about not the context, not
mhm,
history, only
mhm.
think about technology, and that's by design. And which is why I'm so excited to have you here today. I was so excited for this conversation because we need to ground all these technological conversations into the reality. Um,
Mhm.
and my pet peeve has always been about how we relegate the entire Black history to 1 month, like
And
the
the
shortest
shortest
month,
month of the
right?
yes,
Why it's
yes.
just so annoying. And it's great we have a Women's History Month, but I always wonder, why don't we have it every day of the year? Like, why do we keep relegating?
Mhm,
Because Black history is, women's history is American history. Black
mhm,
history is American history.
mhm,
Why are we carving out that and forgetting?
mhm,
Because it gives everybody this, we are all complicit in that. Like rest of the year, everybody's out there doing their own thing. It's like, oh, at least I did something this 1 day or 1 month. So this is
mhm.
where we want to continue. Like the work you're doing is so important. I cannot stress this enough. But I want to make sure
Thank
that
you.
folks understand this is where all of the biases you heard about in
Yes,
technology come from, is the history. There's a historical
yes,
basis for this. Um,
yes.
I would love to hear more about another area that we don't hear enough about. And right now it's so critical. And there are women even in the AI ethics space who are labor activists, right? Because we are seeing a lot of repetition of from a colonial past, from the days of slavery. We are seeing that when the way these technologies are built, developed.
Mhm,
And right now we are seeing a movement towards getting more labor activism. And
mhm,
I would love to hear your perspective in the era of
mhm,
Nannie Helen Burroughs. What was the social justice and labor activism landscape
mhm,
like?
mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And the other reason why I'm happy to discuss this book in this space, and why I have been looking forward to our discussion, is that having it in a space that's dedicated to addressing disparities in technology and through AI has encouraged me to think about the technology of the period in which Burroughs was very active, right? So during that time, of course, we know there was no internet, but there was industrialization, right? There was this advancement of technology through industrialization. And so many Black leaders, including Burroughs, she wasn't alone in this, but many Black leaders who were at that time just one generation out of slavery or had been enslaved themselves were all establishing their own schools and their own organizations to put Black people at the forefront of industrialization, because Black people during slavery had built the foundation for industrialization, but of course, they never benefited from it. Right. So after emancipation in 1863, and if we're counting Texas, it's not until 1865. And if we count Delaware, it's not until the year 1900 when slavery was taken off of the books. Um, Black people were saying, how do we claim our rightful place in this economy that we built? right? So technology for them was always at the forefront. So, for example, in thinking about Burroughs' work, she started, as I mentioned earlier, the National Association of Wage Earners, and that was not only to advocate for Black domestic workers, but it was to provide, as she put it, domestic science training. And so Black people have always believed in the importance of education as a tool against oppression, right? And so one way in which to claim their rightful places in the economy is to have an education. And so she thought, and as well as other leaders, that if we have a rigorous education in the latest technologies, right? For domestic science, it would have been, the latest cleaning technologies, right? The latest ovens, the latest refrigerators, that kind of thing. If we know this knowledge, then if we have this knowledge, then perhaps we can demand the wages that match our expertise, right? So you have also Black women. She was a part of the National Association of Colored Women, which was the largest organization for Black women in the country. It was founded in 1896. And Mia, I can't tell you what they did not do. They advocated for, because Black women had nothing at the time, right? They were literally starting from scratch. And the people who founded the NACW had been enslaved, right? Burroughs' parents had been enslaved. She didn't even know the exact year she was born because her parents had been enslaved, and those records had been kept from them. So they set up voting rights organizations for Black women, but also the larger Black community, because their method was, because Black women suffered from racial and gender discrimination, if they became free, if they got their political rights and their economic rights and their social rights, then all of that would flow downward and would help everyone else. It would help Black men, it would help Black children, it would help people who weren't Black, right? It would help immigrants of color, BIPOC. I mean, it would help everyone, right? So they always had this sense of, we work from Black women at the center. And then so they set up small schools in every single small city, rural town across the US. They set up voter education classes. They had conferences. I mean, they set up their own periodicals to inform Black communities about what was going on in terms of policies and everything. They set up their own business organizations. So this is kind of the landscape. And they also had to set up their own organizations as Black women because they had to confront patriarchy, right, among some Black men leaders, right? So for example, Booker T. Washington started the National Negro Business League to bring Black business leaders together. But he only believed in men leading this organization. So the National Association of Colored Women just, they said, well, we'll have to do our own thing. And one last thing I'll mention, labor unions, right, which were started in the early 1800s, mostly centered the experiences of white men. And so even Black men were excluded from many labor unions from their membership. And even when they were accepted as members, they weren't elected to national and international leadership positions. So if you can imagine, if Black men had it hard, then Black women had it hard. And so there were many labor unions at the time who did not want to organize with Black women. And Burroughs actually tried to charter her labor organization with the American Federation of Labor in the early 1900s. But at the time, the leaders of that organization said no. And they weren't even willing to organize with white domestic workers. So the fact that Black women were asking for their help in organizing Black women domestic workers was something that they refused to do. So so they dealt a lot with patriarchy and racism, and so Black women were forming their own institutions.
Thank you so much for that. I want to share a few comments with you before
Okay.
I share. Um, Jessica said, I know this is off topic, but you're such a compelling and dynamic speaker, Dr. Phillips
Oh,
Cunningham. Love your storytelling style. And I have
thank
to
you.
echo that. I
Thank you.
honestly, I could sit here listening to you all day because this is such an amazing topic and the way you're sharing. It
Thank
is
you.
incredible. Thank you for that. And thank you, Tawana, for sharing. Thank you
Yes,
for
thank you.
explaining that link to data and technology. Mia, I was enjoying the conversation, but I didn't see the link. But you're exactly spot on. And this is what we need. And especially this time in history. I
Mm-hmm.
Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, right? The
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
institution, which is why your work is so important to historically like situate us and give us context for what is
Mm-hmm.
happening right now has happened before. And we also
Mm-hmm.
have another amazing historian who I believe is in the audience today, Mar Hicks. We are
Okay.
such a big fan of Mar as well. They are coming to our event tomorrow, the book festival. So we'll continue this conversation into
Wonderful.
how some of these inequalities have been showing up in the world of programming as well.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is
Mm-hmm.
connected, everything is interconnected. So I just want to just call out that the work, even though it seems that what does this have to do with AI? What does this have to
Yeah.
do with technology? We are seeing the same issues, just the segregation of like the haves and the have-nots based on race,
Yes.
based on gender. Who gets the platform? Who doesn't get the
Mm-hmm.
platform?
Mm-hmm.
Whose work gets invisibilized, and also whose labor is
Mm-hmm.
minimized and not you are talking about unpaid labor
Mm-hmm.
that Black women did the work, but they did the work for everyone and they didn't
Mm-hmm.
even benefit from that. The credit went to other people and white institutions. And I just
Mm-hmm.
love this formidable figure from history who's just like, no, this is not okay. And I'm just going to build our own. Like, no, and I keep thinking about that. It's like,
Yeah.
no, even we look at right now what's happening in politics in the US, it's
Mm-hmm.
nobody's coming to save us. All of these institutions. Right? I mean, this is why we need more. We need more inspiration, and which is why I was still looking forward to having you to help us, also inspire us.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the lessons that we can learn from this amazing woman in history. Um, and the thing is, she didn't come from privilege. We are so used to it.
No.
The Western society, right? The gaze is always, we're looking at all of these successful women. I say, oh, we
Mm-hmm.
want to be like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to be that. These are a lot of them are doing amazing work, but they came from
Mm-hmm.
privilege,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have been trained by society to look at successful people
Mm-hmm.
and look at success as some sort of as like there's as if success tells you anything about a person's actual contributions or their values,
Yeah.
any of that. So I love
Yeah.
this, and I cannot stop thinking about how many of these lessons are relevant today in the world
Mm-hmm.
of AI, world of like everything that's happening in politics, labor movements especially.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
can you help
Mm-hmm.
us like make us share with us some lessons from the NTS, the training school. You said
Mm-hmm.
education is so important. Can
Yeah.
you help us understand what lessons can we take away from that that could be applied today?
Yeah. Um, and I just want to go back a little bit as you were talking, Mia. You brought up so many good points. And in even further fleshing out the connections between this history and technology, is that sometimes technology has been used as the actual tool to keep right? Politically marginalized and economically marginalized people at the margins, right? And so part of the reason why Black women weren't hired in factories is because of the machinery, right? That was technology, that was advanced technology for the period. And there was all this scientific and racist beliefs and sexist beliefs that Black women did not have the innate capabilities, right? They weren't intelligent enough to operate machinery. Because, and so we see some of those stereotypes now, you know, and that people assume you can't become, right, an expert in technology because you really aren't, you don't have the biological capability. There are still some people who believe that, you know, if we look at even some of the congressional confirmation hearings of people who were nominated in the US to administrative positions, um, someone even said that he believes Black people are automatically immune to pain and disease. Well, those were the exact same stereotypes that were created about Black people during slavery to justify slavery and to say that slavery really wasn't a horrific, inhumane institution. That, oh, they're fine, they don't feel pain anyway. It doesn't matter if you exploit them and work them to death, right? So even though it's crazy, even though these ideas were made in the 1700s, that period is actually in the minds of folk today who are making policies, who are drafting the executive orders, because it's not just the president. People are drafting, they're writing those executive orders behind the scenes, and they're so powerful that we don't even recognize their faces. So we see the people out front, but then there are people behind, right? So so thinking also about how to use technology in creative ways to address these disparities, I think is a lesson we can take from Burroughs School. If we're to take the example of domestic science, actually she had a hard time getting funding for her school. She wanted, it was a private school, and she didn't want the government to fund it because she was very adamant that, and as you can imagine, there were all white men in Congress at that time, that they would want to, as she put it, dumb down her curriculum and would not want to see Black women have access to various occupations. So domestic science, she actually didn't teach it as a subject to train Black women how to serve white families. She taught domestic science classes as like a food chemistry program, right? So some of the questions she asked were, um, uh, um, how do vegetables influence the body? How many nutrients are ingested from teas? In which country are certain teas grown? How can you protect yourself from oven related injuries? I mean, these were all questions about that prepared students not only to protect themselves in their workplaces, which were in the private homes of white people, but also for health and survival. You know, it was for themselves, right? So I think also just always having that critical lens of using education in a way that actually disrupts racial and gender disparities. And I think that's the work that your organization is doing, Mia. I think if Burroughs were living now, she would be all up in the mix in all these different spaces, and the importance of um, establishing your own organization. She believed in pressuring the government because she understood the power of voting, and it is powerful. It is a powerful tool. That's why they continue to try to dismantle it. Just here in Georgia, the state legislature announced that they are kicking off 245,000 people from the voting rolls. So they wouldn't keep coming for voters if it were not powerful, if voting wasn't a powerful tool. But she also said, build the organizations you want to see. Don't wait for people to form those organizations for you. You do it yourself and you run it, and because it'll never happen. It'll never happen because people in charge are usually folks who maintain the status quo and who have that power. And you'll never see any racism or sexism dismantled if organizations don't apply pressure. And as you said, no one's going to come to save us or rescue us. We have to do this ourselves.
Amen. Everything you said so powerful, and we have been living it. We've been living it
Mhm,
since this organization was formed. We are seeing
mhm,
everything that you're saying. The histories are the mistakes from the past being repeated. We've
mhm,
always, I feel like what's powerful here is the fact that we are not learning those lessons, and I feel that's
mhm,
where
mhm.
we we are condemned and we are doomed to keep repeating it, which is why your work, I'm so happy it's in the mix. I'm so happy we
Thank you.
found you because these are the lessons we need to learn. And I want to share something in about what's happening right now, just to give people context about how history is rewritten. NASA, NASA was just ordered to remove
Mm,
anything that talks about women, people of
yes,
color in,
yes.
yeah, from its website. So they're scrubbing. So why does it matter? And this is intentional to make the case for why women are not qualified. So on one hand, you
Mhm,
will raise their contributions and say women don't contribute anything. Then
mhm.
they set up this drama and see women are not in here. We should promote more women into these positions. But at the same time, just constantly undermining and invisibilizing their contributions. And it is so
Yes.
diabolical. And
Mhm. I like that word.
yeah,
Yes, to describe it.
I,
Yeah.
exactly. And everybody's looking at 2025. What have
Mhm.
you learned? And which is why your book is everything. And I'm so glad you wrote it, that we want to get inspired, we want to learn. So where would you say people tend to see, again, academics tend to look at race, gender, labor as all of these different things, different, again, thinking about it silos. Can you talk to us
Mhm.
about should we think about intersectionality of race,
Mhm.
gender? And you alluded to that, and your work is pretty much deeply grounded in that. And
Mhm.
some lessons that tech organizers, that AI organizers can take away.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when you asked that question, I automatically thought about Burroughs, one of her organizations that she started in 1923, along with Margaret Murray Washington, other Black women leaders at the time, Mary McLeod Bethune, Mary Church Terrell. They started an organization in 1923 on her school's campus, on Burroughs School's campus, called the International Council of Women of the Darker Races of the World. And I love saying that entire phrase, the entire like name of the organization, because I think it's so powerful. And they had this very global, expansive analysis of racial, gender, and labor disparities. So for them, racism and sexism were huge issues in the United States, but it was also a global problem, right? And so they founded the organization as an African diasporic organization for women, and for them they included actually South Asia in that diaspora. And they worked with women from India and from Sri Lanka. It was a collaborative endeavor. Women from Haiti, Liberia, South Africa, and all parts of the US. And they produced many reports, some of the first research reports about intersecting racial and gender disparities that impact women's working experiences, not only in the workplace, but beyond. Because for them, of course, women are full human beings. So it's not only about what they experience at work, but what happens outside of work influences them and vice versa, right? Their lives. And as Kimberly Crenshaw mentions, several decades later, after the founding of the International Council of Women of the Darker Races of the World, um, she created this wonderful term that really brings together this school of thought, which is based in reality, that race and gender never operate separately. And no one is outside of the interdisciplinary, well, the intersectionality of race and gender inequalities. No one does. So I think as we organize, whether it's within the world of technology, or if we're doing labor organizing, if we're doing just community organizing around voting rights, around housing rights, I think the lesson to take from Burroughs and her work with other women during her period is that it's always important to ask about racial and gender disparities, because if you leave one out, then you will miss, right, critical issues, and you will inevitably exclude women. So you have to constantly, because it's just the reality. And unfortunately in this country, and I'm speaking about the US, people don't want to talk about race. People do not want to talk about race, even as they unpack the election from 2024. Some people talk about it as though a Black woman did not run for president. And so yeah, these are issues that people will resist and try to shut down, but they're just so important. So I think the persistent questioning and addressing of racial and gender disparities is an important lesson to take from Burroughs' history.
Thank you for that. We needed to hear that. Also, not talking about race is
Mhm.
intentional
Yes,
because
yes,
it is trying to make people not make white people feel uncomfortable.
exactly.
So we
Exactly.
and which is why
Exactly.
we created this space. We need to be able to have those conversations. And else, this is how it escalates. That now we are at this point, we cannot talk about anything. We are at this point that
Mhm.
everything we say is deemed to be political. Everything,
Mhm.
and then we end up in a place that there will be no politics. Everything is just about catering to the whims of the 1%, the billionaires
Yes.
that they are deciding now everything for. This is how everything
Yes.
that is a trickle down, where the trickle down is
Yes.
whatever they want now goes. So I just feel like this was,
Yes.
we could not have timed it in any better. I just was so glad that you were able to make time for us to have
Oh,
this extremely important conversation. I mean, thank you. Before I want to thank you before we jump into the Q&A, because there are a bunch of questions for you. But can I just say
okay.
thank you so much from all
Oh,
of us
thank you.
making this
Thank you.
journey. Okay, so we're going to a question. Sometimes we do go a few minutes over. If you're open to it, is that okay? If you have,
Perfectly fine. Perfectly
okay,
fine. Mhm.
amazing. For anyone who has to drop off, I want to just let you know we are making a huge announcement tomorrow. Yes, we are setting up a new organization.
Ah.
Yes, I could not, as you were saying that this is why we have to set up our own organizations. Our organization has always been volunteer led, and Let me just say this, women are not a charity. We are not a charity. We have to stop thinking about ourselves as charities. We have to think about how we can invest in ourselves and help each other prosper together. So tomorrow, don't miss, we will be announcing it at the book festival tomorrow.
Oh,
I hope you can join us. And yes, so that was essentially it. So I will stop the recording at this point. And again, thank you so much for joining us before we go into the Q&A.
oh,
Thank
wonderful. Congratulations.